Welcome to our second week of our Summer in the Sermon on the Mount. If you were with us last week, you'll remember back, we were looking at what are called the Beatitudes that began with that word, repeated word, blessed, blessed, blessed. Such a wonderfully, distinctively Christian start to the sermon. So typically Jesus speaking of a God who wants to bless, not asking us to come and do for him, but rather speaking of what he wants to do for us, blessing poured out. But what was so striking about the Beatitudes was who the blessing is given to. Did you notice it wasn't to those who were strong or able or successful? No, the blessing was given almost to the polar opposite extreme. Jesus is looking for people who are not proud, but who are humble. Not people who are self-righteous, but people who are dependent. Jesus was not looking for hypocrites. He said he's looking for the hungry. Particularly, he said, people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness. That's the attitude at the heart of the Beatitudes that drives the whole of the Sermon on the Mount, the disposition that we're to come with. But it's an attitude, says Jesus as the sermon goes on, that will work itself out in action. And that's where we start to move as we work our way into the heart of the sermon, or you might say that the main flow of the Sermon on the Mount. But before we get into the full flow of it, it's as though in this week's passage we go back to the source, the source of the sermon, if you like, and two particular pictures or places from which the whole sermon will flow out. First of all, we're going to look at verses 13 to 16, where Jesus gives us two images that help us understand what it will look like if we live out this teaching. It's a glorious vision for us based around two metaphors, the metaphors of salt and light. Now, I'm going to let you spend a bit of time using your imagination to understand how it is those metaphors work exactly. They're famous and distinctively Christian. Salt, that keeps its saltiness, and light like a city on a hill shining out. But in the end, don't forget to use verse 16 to guide your interpretation. It's there that Jesus says, chapter 5, verse 16, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. That's going to be the end result of Christians living out this teaching. Glory going not to us, but to our Father in heaven. That's the first source, if you like, of the outflow that will be the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. And then the next is found in verses 17 to 20 as we get down to the nitty-gritty of where this teaching is going to come from. And this little section, verses 17 to 20, I think functions a bit like the top of the sermon, which is then tailed later on in the sermon. Because Jesus says, verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. The law and the prophets is where all of this teaching comes from. And Jesus says, I've come to fulfill this. Now, obviously, in the first instance, that must refer to the perfectly righteous life that he lives out. A perfect righteousness that again and again the Bible says he gives to us, not because of anything we've done, but because of his grace to us. An imputed righteousness, to use the technical theological term. But it's a righteousness that he wants us then to live out. So much of the Sermon on the Mount is going to be about that, but you can see it straight away in verse 19. He says, therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. These are ideas that start the Sermon on the Mount and then that begin to finish the Sermon on the Mount. So in chapter 7, verse 12, Jesus says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, sometimes called the golden rule. For this is the law and prophets. Law and prophets at the beginning of the sermon, law and prophets as a summary of the teaching of the sermon. Remember, Jesus says in chapter 5 in our verses, do this teaching, do it. And then at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. Another great metaphor for us. Or verse 26 of chapter 7, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. This is where the teaching is going to come from, as Jesus, standing on top of the mountain, expounds the law of God for the Christian today. This is the source of the teaching. And that's where we're going back to today, to be at the source, to see where it's all going to flow out from, so that as the weeks go on, we see both where it's come from and are reminded of what it will look like to live this out. So now again, it's over to you. Again, you'll be in your groups working it out wherever you are. You've got all the questions in the dialogue box below, or you can download it on the sheet, and you just got to get into it for yourselves. Again, worth allocating one person just to keep you moving through. Agree what time you're going to aim to finish by, and make sure you pray along the way. But listen up, because this is great teaching from God that he wants to give to us at this moment in time.